You walk through the door, you're an adult. You pay your own bills. You've made decisions that reshaped your life. You've built, through experience, through failure, through the slow work of becoming, a version of yourself that feels real, that feels like you. And then, within minutes of being home, something starts to shift. Your voice changes, goes quieter, or tighter, or slightly younger, as though some part of your body remembers being 12 in this hallway and quietly takes over. You start choosing different words, smaller sentences, topics you've already pre-screened for safety before they leave your mouth. You eat what's served without saying you don't want it. You skip the thing that happened at work. You nod through opinions you strongly disagree with, and when you catch yourself doing it, you're barely even surprised. Because this is just how it is in this house. And somewhere around the second hour, you notice it. The person sitting at that table is not the same person who left this morning. Somewhere between the car and the front door, that person quietly stepped aside. This isn't ingratitude, it isn't weakness, it isn't some character flaw you haven't managed to fix. It is one of the most consistent, most studied, and most quietly painful patterns in adult psychology. And it has a name. Psychologists call it regression to role. But the lived experience is simpler than that. You go home, and you become who you learned to be there. Not who you are now, who you were shaped to be. If something about that sentence landed somewhere quiet, it's because you've already been watching this happen. You may have walked in 100 times with the same resolve, this time will be different, this time I'll just be myself, and watched it happen anyway, like a tide you couldn't stop. The question isn't whether this happens, the question is why. And the deeper question, the one that actually matters, is what this pattern tells us about who was allowed to exist in that house, and what happened to the parts of you that weren't. Let's start with what it actually feels like, because it doesn't look the same for everyone. For some people, going home means a retreat into quiet. You speak less, share less. You monitor every sentence before it leaves your mouth, calculating how it will land, who it might disturb, what conversation it might accidentally start. You read the room the moment you arrive, checking the energy like a weather report and adjusting accordingly. You've been doing this since childhood. You're very good at it. For others, it's more confusing. You become louder, but in the wrong ways. You argue. You dig in on things that don't really matter. You find yourself saying things with an edge that surprises even you. And afterwards, you sit with the uncomfortable feeling of not knowing where any of that came from. Somewhere inside that sharpness is a version of you that never got to say the things it needed to say. And it's still trying. For others still, it's entirely physical. Your shoulders rise, your jaw tightens. There's a low-grade tension that starts in the car on the way over, sometimes even the night before, and doesn't fully lift until you're well down the road home. What all of these different experiences share is this. The nervous system knows something the thinking mind is still negotiating with. Your body remembers what it learned in that house. And the moment you walk back in, it starts running old code. Programs built when you were small, when the stakes were enormous, when the behavioral responses that kept you emotionally regulated were the ones you most needed to survive the environment you were in. This is not a failure. This is not something to fix with more awareness or more effort. It is, actually, the nervous system working exactly as it was designed to. People with high differentiation can be fully present with their family, even in moments of conflict or pressure, without losing the thread of who they are. They feel the pull of old dynamics. They notice the roles the system wants them to play, but they're not automatically pulled into them. People with lower differentiation, which describes most of us to varying degrees, tend toward one of two responses. Either they fuse, they walk in and within hours they've become the adapted child again, absorbed back into the system as though the last 20 years didn't happen. Or they cut off. They stop going, stop calling, keep the family at arm's length, because the only way they found to stay themselves is to stay away. Neither fusion nor cutoff is a solution. Both are responses to the same underlying difficulty, the challenge of being fully yourself in the presence of people who knew you when you were someone else. What makes this hard is that the pull is invisible. It doesn't feel like fear. It doesn't feel like compliance. Most of the time, it just feels like being home. The attachment research adds another layer that's important to understand. The early attachment patterns you developed with your primary caregivers shape your nervous system's responses in close relationships, not just in childhood, but for decades into adulthood. If you developed what researchers call anxious attachment, in environments where love felt somewhat conditional, where approval was inconsistent, where you learned early to track the emotional state of a parent with extraordinary precision, your nervous system internalized a specific priority: harmony first, authenticity second. This isn't a choice you make, it's wired. The physical discomfort of sensing a parent's disappointment, that specific activation in the chest, the stomach, the throat, isn't just social discomfort. Your nervous system interprets it as threat, responds to it as threat, and mobilizes accordingly. The adapted self doesn't come online because you decided to comply. It comes online because something in you, faster than thought, assessed the environment and activated the most reliable safety strategy it knows. And then there's what happens with identity over time. Most of us build our adult sense of self through a gradual process of individuating from our family of origin, developing our own values, our own relationship with our emotional life, our own way of understanding the world that doesn't simply mirror what we were handed. But this individuation is rarely clean. It's rarely complete, because the family system exerts its own gravity. It carries an image of who you are, built from years of watching you, from shared history, from the roles you filled, and that image can be almost impossible to update. You may have done years of work. You may be genuinely, substantially different from who you were at 16. But at the family dinner table, the conversation can still feel like it's happening to the 16-year-old. Your family may love you deeply and still see you through a lens that stopped being accurate a decade ago. And when the people around you relate to an older version of you, it is very hard not to slide into becoming that version. The self that exists in every other context of your life, at work, with friends, alone, is not the self that gets activated in that kitchen. And the gap between the two is one of the loneliest feelings there is. This is part of why these visits are so exhausting. It's not the travel, it's not the food or the sleeping arrangements. It's the sustained effort of existing in two states simultaneously, maintaining some fragile thread of your actual self while operating within the family's version of who you are, holding both things at once, for hours, for days. It's the effort of sitting across the table from someone who loves you and still hearing, in a particular tone of voice, every concern they've ever had about your choices, and not contracting into the child who needed their approval, and mostly failing at that, and watching yourself mostly fail and not being able to stop it. It's the effort of sitting in a silence that meant something specific when you were young, and still means that specific thing to your nervous system, decades later, in a body that is 40-something years old, and somehow still waiting for the temperature to shift. The cost of this is real, and it often shows up later, hours after you leave, the next day, when you're back in your own space and something has quietly gone flat. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from these visits. Not tiredness, not even stress exactly. Something more like a deflation. The feeling of having been compressed into a smaller shape than you actually are, and not fully having expanded back yet. And alongside that, sometimes a grief that doesn't quite have a name. Because what you're mourning isn't a dramatic wound. You're mourning the quieter thing. The version of yourself that didn't get to exist fully in that house. The feelings that were never quite held. The conversations that were never quite safe to have. The needs that were consistently smaller than the room required them to be. There can also be resentment, low-grade, persistent, guilt-producing, because nothing dramatic happened. Your parents aren't villains. They were shaped by their own histories, their own adaptations, their own families who passed down compressed versions of themselves. They did what they knew how to do. And yet, the pattern costs you something. It takes a version of you offline every time. And at some point, acknowledging that cost, without needing to assign blame, without needing to make anyone the enemy, becomes not just important but necessary, because you can't address what you're not willing to name. So what actually changes? Not contact, not distance, not the fantasy of finally having the one conversation that rewrites everything. What changes is differentiation, your capacity to remain yourself, grounded in your own values, your own perspective, your own emotional regulation, even inside the pull of the family system. This is slower work than it sounds, and it doesn't begin with your family. It begins with you, outside that context, building a more honest relationship with who you actually are, what you actually feel, and what you actually value when no one's watching and nothing depends on performing ease. Because the adapted self doesn't only appear at home. It shows up in workplaces where authority figures trigger old dynamics, in friendships where you unconsciously take the familiar role, in any relationship where the nervous system recognizes a pattern it learned long ago and starts running the response it archived alongside it. The work is learning to notice it earlier, to feel the contraction before it becomes total, to catch yourself mid-sentence, reaching for the safer word, and sometimes, not always, choosing the real one instead. This doesn't mean becoming combative. It doesn't mean oversharing at the dinner table. It doesn't mean treating every family visit as an opportunity for confrontation. It means maintaining a thread, keeping some version of your actual perspective present, even when it's not always spoken, choosing deliberately not to disappear entirely.